The wind howled through the narrow streets of Dead Rock, stirring dust that clung to the faces of the townsfolk like the ghosts of past sins. The noose hung heavy and taut, swaying slightly in the dry air as Thomas McKenna stood on the gallows, hands bound behind his back. He stared out into the crowd, eyes scanning faces he didn't recognize, except for the one he couldn't forget, the face of Sheriff Garrett, whose hardened eyes betrayed a deep satisfaction at what was about to unfold. A hushed silence settled over the square as the townsfolk waited. The heat of the midday sun pressed down, casting long shadows on the dusty ground. Thomas swallowed hard, the taste of fear thick in his throat. He wasn't afraid of dying. Not really, but the injustice of it gnawed at him. He had never stolen the stagecoach money, never had the chance to explain. And now, the crowd would get their way. They would see him swing from the rope, the very thing they believed him guilty of, but they didn't know the truth. His sister, Mary, would never know. The boy, Timothy, his nephew, sick and alone, would never know that it wasn't his uncle who had betrayed them all. It had been the setup of a lifetime, and Thomas was the one to pay for it. The noose burned against his neck, and he closed his eyes, thinking of Mary's face, wondering if she still believed in him, still trusted him. The thought was a brief comfort in a moment of complete abandonment. Then the sheriff raised his hand. The crowd held its collective breath, and the air seemed to thicken, a pregnant pause before the death sentence was carried out. Thomas thought of nothing but the rope tightening, the world darkening. But then a crack split the silence. A gunshot. The rope snapped above Thomas's head, sending a spray of frayed hemp flying into the air. The crowd erupted in screams, ducking for cover, some running for the safety of the nearest building. The sheriff spun around, his hand reaching for his gun, eyes wild as he searched the rooftops for the shooter. Thomas felt the noose slip loose, and he stumbled forward, almost falling off the platform. Before he could fully grasp the chaos around him, another shot rang out, striking the wooden beam that held the gallows, causing the platform to lean dangerously. The crowd surged back, a wave of panic flooding through them. And then a figure emerged from the shadows. Tall, lean, his coat billowing like liquid shadow, the stranger stepped into the square, moving with a purpose that cut through the confusion. His revolver was already in his hand, not aiming to kill, but to scatter the crowd. He fired twice, sharp, precise, sending people diving behind wagons and storefronts. The stranger's horse, a massive black stallion, thundered into the square, its hooves striking the ground with the weight of inevitability. Without breaking stride, the rider reached down, grabbing Thomas by the shirt, hoisting him onto the saddle with a surprising amount of strength. "Hold on." The man's voice was low, rough like gravel in a tin can, barely audible over the shouts and gunfire. The horse surged forward, kicking up dust, and Thomas, still disoriented, gripped the saddle tightly. The sheriff fired off a single shot, wild, desperate, but it missed. And just like that, Thomas McKenna was no longer on the gallows. The stranger and his steed carried him away from the chaos of Dead Rock, riding hard through the dust and toward the rocky hills on the outskirts of town. The wind whipped at Thomas's face, tearing at his clothes, but the sting of it was nothing compared to the weight of his thoughts. What in God's name was happening? Why was he being saved by someone like this? And who was the man who had just set him free? As they rode deeper into the wilderness, Thomas's head spun, his mind racing to piece together the broken fragments of his life. But for the first time since his arrest, he wasn't alone. There was something about the stranger, something unnerving, but also strangely comforting, that made him wonder if he wasn't as forgotten as he had believed. The sound of hooves pounding against the earth was the only thing that kept him grounded as the town of Dead Rock faded into the distance. The wind carried the scent of dry earth and sagebrush, whispering through the canyon walls as the stranger led Thomas away from Dead Rock. They rode in silence, the pounding of hooves the only sound between them, until the last remnants of the town disappeared behind a bend in the rocky hills. Thomas's heart was still racing from the chaos he had just escaped. His breath came in short gasps, chest tight with the fear and confusion that had gripped him since the moment he was placed on that gallows. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting the sheriff and his men to come galloping after them, guns drawn. But the only sound was the wind, sharp and unyielding, like nature itself mocking him. Finally, the stranger slowed his horse. They came to a stop near a cluster of red rocks, the black stallion's hooves scraping against the rocky ground. The stranger dismounted, his movements calm and deliberate, as though everything about this moment was planned. Thomas swung his leg over the horse's side, his legs unsteady as he landed in the dust. The stranger's eyes, dark, cold eyes that seemed to hold all the secrets of the world, studied him for a long moment. "You're supposed to be dead by now, Thomas McKenna," the stranger said, his voice like gravel grinding beneath heavy boots. His tone wasn't accusatory, just matter of fact, as if he knew something Thomas didn't. Thomas froze, his heart stopping for a beat. He had never heard that voice before, but the way the man said his full name sent a chill down his spine. No one called him that, not since he'd left his old life behind. Not unless they were looking to collect a bounty. The stranger took a step closer, his boots crunching the dirt beneath him. Thomas took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his feet were rooted to the ground. There was something dangerous about this man, something Thomas couldn't quite place. The stranger removed his wide-brimmed hat, revealing a face scarred by time and violence. His hair was a streak of gray, wild and unkempt, falling around a face that seemed to be etched by hardship and regret. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as recognition hit him like a blow. "Blackjack Morrison," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. The name was enough to send a tremor through him. Blackjack Morrison, the most feared outlaw in the Arizona Territory. The man who had disappeared 3 years ago after the Tombstone Massacre, leaving only whispers and bloodstains behind. The man whose face was plastered across wanted posters from here to California, dead or alive. But here he was standing in front of Thomas, alive and very much real. Blackjack studied him for a long moment, then smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. "Not many people recognize me these days. You must be the lucky one," he said, his voice low, almost mocking. Thomas could feel the weight of Blackjack's gaze, as if the man were stripping him down to his very soul. But why? Why had he saved him from the gallows? "You think I did you a favor, McKenna?" Blackjack's voice cut through the silence, his words laced with something darker. "I'm not in the business of saving people. I saved you because I need something from you. And I'm betting you need something from me, too." Thomas blinked, trying to wrap his mind around the situation. He had just been pulled from the brink of death, but now he was face to face with the most notorious outlaw in the West, a man whose very name sent shivers down the spines of the bravest men in the territory. The man who had left destruction in his wake and lived to tell the tale. "You need something from me?" Thomas repeated, his voice hoarse. He was still trying to figure out if he was about to be used as a pawn in some twisted game, or if there was something more to this rescue than he understood. Blackjack's smile faded, and his eyes hardened. "You've been framed, McKenna. Someone planted that stagecoach money on you, and now the sheriff wants to see you hang for it. But the truth is, you're not the one who took it. I know who did, and I can help you if you help me." Thomas felt a pang of disbelief. "Help you? What could I possibly do for you?" Blackjack took a step forward, his boots making a soft crunch in the dirt. "You've got information that could help me track down the man who's been hunting me, the same man who set you up. And trust me, you're not the only one who's been wronged here. We both have debts to settle, McKenna." Thomas narrowed his eyes, suspicion and fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. "And why should I trust you? You're a killer, a thief. You've destroyed families, and now you want me to help you." Blackjack's eyes flickered with something like regret, but it was gone in an instant. "I don't expect you to trust me," he said, his voice low and controlled. "But I'm giving you a chance to survive, a chance to clear your name. You don't have to accept. But if you don't, you're as good as dead." Those men on horseback. He nodded back toward the canyon entrance. where the distant sound of hoofbeats was growing louder. They're coming for us, and they won't stop until we're 6 feet under. The reality of the situation hit Thomas hard. There was no running from this. He had been framed for a crime he didn't commit, and now the very man who had haunted the Arizona territory for years was offering him a chance to escape. But the price was steep. "You want me to help you take down the man who set me up?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. "And what do you want from me?" Blackjack's lips curled into a grim smile. "Everything. But for now, all I need is your trust. We're going to make them regret ever putting you on that gallows, McKenna. But you need to decide, are you with me, or are you with them?" The sound of the approaching posse was unmistakable now, and Thomas knew that the time for decisions had come. He glanced at Blackjack, whose cold, hard eyes never wavered. Thomas took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. For better or worse, his fate was tied to the outlaw before him. "All right," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty that gripped him. "I'm with you. For now." Blackjack nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Good. Let's move." And with that, they rode deeper into the canyon, toward whatever awaited them. The canyon walls loomed high above them, the towering rock formations casting long shadows as the pair rode deeper into the maze of red stone and dried-out brush. The sounds of the approaching posse were now distant, muted by the narrow paths and the weight of the rocky landscape. But Blackjack's cold, calculating eyes never left the horizon, scanning for any signs of danger. Thomas rode silently behind him, feeling the tension thick in the air between them. The betrayal of his sister still haunted his thoughts. The woman he'd loved, the one who'd been like a second mother to him since their parents died, was now a mastermind in this tangled web of lies and revenge. He could hardly believe it. How could she do this? How could she align herself with the very man who had killed so many innocent people, including their own father? And yet, here he was, riding with Blackjack Morrison, the very embodiment of everything Thomas had sworn to avoid. Outlaw, killer, mastermind of the Tombstone Massacre. His heart still pounded with a mix of fear, anger, and confusion. But at this point, he had no choice. He had been given no choice. "We're not far from my camp." Blackjack's voice broke through the heavy silence, rough as a mountain storm. "But we need to move fast. That posse's not going to give up on you. You're a dead man walking in their eyes, McKenna, and I'm sure as hell not going to let them catch you while I'm still around." Thomas nodded stiffly, still processing the strange alliance he found himself in. His fingers tightened around the reins, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled deeper into something far darker than he ever could have imagined. He had been a clerk, a man who had done nothing but keep his head down and work hard for the little he had. He had never asked for this. He had never wanted this. But now, for better or worse, he was in it, neck deep. Blackjack's horse shifted nervously beneath him, its dark coat gleaming under the dim light. Blackjack's gaze flicked to Thomas, his expression unreadable. "Got a few questions for you, McKenna," he said, his tone low but firm. "You ever killed a man?" Thomas's stomach twisted at the question. He was a man of morals. He hadn't taken life. Not unless it was in self-defense. Not unless it was to protect those he loved. The question sat like a stone in his chest, and he swallowed hard before answering. "No, I've never killed anyone." Blackjack raised an eyebrow. "Never," he repeated, as though he were trying to gauge the truth in Thomas's words. "Not even when you had no choice? When your life was on the line?" Thomas thought back to the night of the robbery, to the way things had spiraled out of control. The sound of gunfire, the screams of terrified people, and the chaos that followed. He hadn't killed anyone that night, but he had been prepared to. He had been ready to. "I've never had to," Thomas said quietly, meeting Blackjack's eyes. "But I've seen it. Seen enough to know it's not something I could just walk away from. That's not who I am." Blackjack didn't respond right away. He just kept riding, his eyes scanning the canyon around them, always vigilant. The wind whispered through the jagged rock formations, carrying the scent of dust and the promise of trouble. Blackjack, however, seemed at peace in this vast, hostile landscape. He had the air of a man who had lived through hell and come out the other side, scarred but unbroken. "You've got the right idea," Blackjack said, his voice quiet but full of weight. "A man's got to know what he's capable of. Whether he likes it or not, the world's a hard place. And sometimes you got to make hard choices." "I know that," Thomas replied. "But I didn't choose this. I didn't ask for any of this." "Doesn't matter if you asked for it, son," Blackjack said, his tone turning cold. "This world's got a funny way of deciding what you get. You don't get to decide your fate. The only thing you get to decide is how you handle it." A distant sound of hooves brought Thomas back to the present. His eyes darted to the horizon. In the distance, he saw the flicker of movement, a group of riders heading their way. His heart skipped a beat. "They're close," Thomas muttered, his grip tightening around his rifle. His mind raced as the realization hit him. The posse wasn't far behind. The sheriff's men were closing in fast. They wouldn't stop until they had him, and Blackjack had made it clear they weren't going to let anything stand in their way. Blackjack's lips curled into a grim smile, his fingers twitching toward the revolver at his side. "Doesn't matter how close they are. We've got the advantage. They'll never make it past us. But you need to keep your wits about you. I didn't save your hide just to see you get gunned down now." Thomas nodded, but couldn't shake the dread building in his chest. Blackjack wasn't wrong. He had no choice but to follow this dangerous path now. But there was something about the outlaw's words, the coldness in his voice, that made Thomas wonder just how much of a choice he really had. They kept moving through the canyon, the walls growing steeper, the shadows longer. Every step seemed to echo in the silence between them. Thomas felt like he was walking on a knife's edge. One wrong move, and he would fall into a trap from which there would be no return. Blackjack slowed his horse as they reached a narrow passage between two massive boulders. The area was perfect for an ambush. Thomas's pulse quickened as he scanned the surroundings, his hand instinctively resting on the revolver at his belt. Blackjack turned to him, his voice barely a whisper. "This is where we make our stand, McKenna. This is where we find out what you're really made of." Thomas's heart thundered in his chest as he realized the truth. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. This was a test of loyalty, of courage, of survival. And the stakes were higher than he ever could have imagined. Behind them, the sound of hooves grew louder, a reminder that time was running out. Thomas took a deep breath, tightening his grip on the reins. Whatever came next, he had no choice but to face it head on. He was already in too deep. "Let's see if you can handle the rest of this," Blackjack said, pulling his hat lower over his eyes. "Because when the storm hits, you either survive or you don't." And with that, they rode into the heart of the canyon, waiting for the inevitable showdown that would either make or break them. The canyon walls seemed to close in around them, narrowing to the point where only one man could ride through at a time. The wind whistled between the rocks, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. Thomas's heart beat in his chest like a war drum, each step of his horse a reminder that he was stepping deeper into a trap of his own making. Blackjack Morrison, however, appeared calm, collected even. His face, etched with the years of a man who had lived by his own rules, remained unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He wasn't just riding through the canyon. He was waiting for the storm to break. He knew this land, knew its secrets, and in this moment, he was the one in control. Thomas wasn't sure what terrified him more, the fact that he was now trapped between the lawmen and the notorious outlaw, or the creeping suspicion that he was being used as a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. Ahead, he heard the thundering of hooves. It was them, the posse. They were closing in. From the sound of it, they'd figured out the direction Blackjack had taken. They were moving fast, too fast. This wasn't going to end well. Blackjack slowed his horse, pulling it to a stop near a large outcropping of rocks. He dismounted with practiced ease, his movements swift and efficient. Thomas followed suit, his heart pounding in his chest as he did. The time for talking had passed. Now it was time to fight. "Get ready, McKenna." Blackjack's voice was low, almost a whisper, as he moved behind the rocks, taking cover. He pulled out his rifle, inspecting it with the same care he'd shown when handling his revolvers. When they come, you don't hesitate. You shoot, or you die. Simple as that. Thomas took a deep breath, his fingers brushing the worn handle of the rifle Blackjack had handed him earlier. He didn't like the feeling of this. He wasn't a killer, wasn't a man who'd shot to take life. But in this world, sometimes survival meant breaking your own rules. The sound of galloping hooves grew louder, the dust rising like a cloud behind them. The sheriff's men were getting closer. Blackjack didn't flinch, didn't even seem to care. He crouched low behind the rocks, his eyes scanning the horizon, waiting for the first sign of movement. They'll come through the narrow pass, Blackjack murmured, more to himself than to Thomas. It's the only way in. Sure enough, the first rider appeared at the far end of the canyon, moving at a gallop. It was Deputy Wilson, his face grim with determination. Behind him, the rest of the posse followed, their horses kicking up dust in their wake. There were at least 6 of them, their rifles and pistols drawn, their eyes scanning the rocks for any sign of danger. Thomas felt his hand tremble around the rifle, the weight of it unfamiliar and heavy. He was no gunfighter, no outlaw. He was just a man trying to survive. But as the posse moved closer, he knew he had no choice but to stand his ground. On my mark, Blackjack's voice cut through the tension, as calm as ever. Wait until they're in the pass. Then we take 'em. Thomas nodded, though his gut twisted with the realization of what was about to happen. He wasn't ready. He wasn't ready for any of this. But there was no turning back now. This was his chance to either die or survive. And, as Blackjack had said, the only thing left was how he handled it. The first shot rang out from Blackjack's rifle. It cracked through the silence of the canyon, a sharp, cold sound that made Thomas jump in shock. A rider on the far side of the group tumbled from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The posse reacted instantly, drawing their weapons and returning fire. The world exploded into chaos. Shots rang out from every direction as the lawmen took cover behind boulders and rocks. Thomas, his heart in his throat, swung his rifle into position and fired. The bullet struck the rock wall beside one of the deputies, sending chips of stone flying. But it didn't matter. The deputy was already moving, already firing back. The air was thick with the sounds of gunfire and the smell of smoke. The posse wasn't going to back down. They were coming for blood. Blackjack fired again, his shots calculated and precise, picking off the riders with ruthless efficiency. Thomas's rifle kicked against his shoulder each time he fired, and the sound of his own shots felt deafening in the confined space of the canyon. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to the way his stomach churned with each shot, the way his hands shook with the adrenaline coursing through him. He shot again, this time catching a rider in the leg. The man screamed, falling from his horse in a heap. The others were starting to scatter, trying to get a better angle on Blackjack and Thomas. The sound of hooves echoed in the canyon, the lawmen trying to flank them, trying to outsmart them. Blackjack's voice rose above the chaos, calm and steady. Don't let him get behind you, McKenna. Watch your back. Thomas's head snapped to the side. A figure appeared behind a boulder, a rifle raised. Thomas barely had time to react. He swung his rifle around and fired, the shot going wide. But it was enough to make the figure hesitate, just long enough for Blackjack to take him out with a clean shot. The fight raged on, the sound of bullets ricocheting off the canyon walls, the cries of the wounded filling the air. Thomas was beginning to lose track of time, losing himself in the violence of it all. He wasn't sure how many shots he'd taken, how many men he'd hit, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't running anymore. He was fighting. He was fighting for survival. But as the last rider fell to the ground, the sound of gunfire stopped. The dust began to settle, and for a moment, it was eerily quiet. Blackjack stood up from behind the rock, his expression unreadable, his rifle still in hand. He wiped the sweat from his brow and looked over at Thomas, his cold eyes narrowing as he surveyed the aftermath. Well, that wasn't so hard now, was it? Blackjack said with a grin, though there was no warmth in it. He glanced over at the fallen lawman, a glint of something like respect in his eyes. You did good, McKenna. I'll give you that. Thomas, still panting from the exertion, could only nod. His hands were shaking, his heart still racing. The canyon, now littered with bodies, felt like a graveyard. It had all happened so fast. The fight, the violence. He'd barely processed it all. But now, standing among the dead and the dying, he felt something inside him shift. The lawmen were down, but Blackjack wasn't finished yet. The danger wasn't over. Not yet. Blackjack turned to him, his expression unreadable. "We're not done here, McKenna. The sheriff's got something I want. Something he took from me 3 years ago, and I'm not leaving until I get it back." Thomas swallowed hard, the weight of the outlaw's words settling on his shoulders like a boulder. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be clean, but it was his fight now, whether he liked it or not, and he wasn't going to run anymore. The silence of the canyon was suffocating. It hung in the air like smoke from a long-dead fire, thick and oppressive. Thomas McKenna stood among the fallen lawmen, his boots heavy against the dust-coated ground. Blackjack Morrison, ever the enigma, watched him with a glance that spoke volumes, of respect, of wariness, but also of something darker, something much more dangerous. Blackjack didn't flinch as he reloaded his rifle, his movements smooth and precise. For all the violence that had just transpired, he was remarkably calm. Thomas, on the other hand, was still catching his breath, his mind racing to piece together what had just happened and what was still to come. The lawmen had been picked off with ruthless efficiency, but their absence left a gap, a dangerous one. They weren't the only players in this game. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger was only just beginning. "You did get out there, McKenna." Blackjack's voice broke through the silence, but his tone lacked any sense of warmth. "Better than I expected. But we're not out of this yet. Not by a long shot." Thomas wiped the sweat from his forehead, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. He didn't know what Blackjack was really after, but he knew it wasn't just the bounty on his head. There was something more at play here, something bigger than he could understand in the moment. "I don't understand," Thomas said, his voice raw. "Why all this? Why save me, only to drag me into this mess?" Blackjack chuckled darkly, adjusting his hat and glancing around the canyon with sharp eyes. "Why? Because you're part of something bigger than yourself, boy. Don't think for a second that this is about just you and me. It's bigger than that. We both got skin in this game." Thomas furrowed his brow, confused. "What game? I didn't sign up for any of this." Blackjack turned to him, his face hard as granite. "Nobody does, McKenna. Life ain't about signing up. It's about surviving. And sometimes, survival means playing a hand you didn't want to deal with." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of something unspoken, something Thomas could barely grasp. There was a crackling in the distance, more riders, no doubt. The echo of hooves pounding the earth could be heard even over the wind that howled through the narrow passageways of the canyon. Blackjack's eyes narrowed, his hand moving instinctively to his revolver. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice low and tense. Thomas nodded, his pulse quickening again. More men. Blackjack didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his gaze to the north, where the sound of approaching riders grew louder. "They're not the sheriff's men. Those are new players, and they're coming fast." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. His eyes scanned the rocks, the shadows, the narrowing gaps in the canyon walls. Whoever these new riders were, they weren't here for a friendly chat. "They're going to have us trapped, Blackjack. We need to move." Blackjack shook his head slowly, as if calculating their options. "We're in a tight spot, McKenna. There's no easy way out of this canyon. But we'll fight. We don't run, not now." Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. His mind raced, replaying everything that had happened up to this point. The ambush, the lawmen, his sister's twisted involvement. And now these new riders, whoever they were, they had come for blood. "Who are they?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Blackjack's eyes flicked to him, hard as iron. "People I've crossed. People who want me dead. The difference is they're coming for both of us now, McKenna. And they're not just after money." The words hit Thomas like a bolt of lightning. They were after revenge. But whose revenge? And why was Blackjack's name tied to it? Just as the tension in the air reached its breaking point, the first rider appeared at the mouth of the canyon. Tall, dressed in dark clothes, with a wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face. The rider didn't move with the cautiousness of a lawman, nor the haste of an outlaw on the run. No, this man had a purpose, and he wasn't alone. Within seconds, the canyon was filled with riders, at least a dozen strong, fanning out, taking positions in the rocks, cutting off any chance of escape. Blackjack didn't flinch, didn't even seem surprised. He'd expected them, but for Thomas, the full weight of the situation was beginning to settle in his bones. "We're surrounded," Thomas muttered, his voice tight. Blackjack didn't respond right away. Instead, he just stood there, his gaze locked on the riders, watching them with cold calculation. "So, it seems," he said softly, "but they won't just ride in here without a plan. They want something, and they're going to have to fight for it." Before Thomas could ask what Blackjack meant, the riders moved. Like a wave crashing over the rocks, they swept into the canyon, their guns drawn, eyes scanning the rocky terrain. The lead rider, a man with a scar running down his face, raised a hand, signaling his men to stop. Blackjack stood his ground, his rifle raised, his eyes locked onto the man, like a predator stalking prey. "You don't get to decide when this ends, Morrison," the scarred rider called out, his voice rough, his hand tightening on the grip of his rifle. "This is your last stop. Your family's legacy ends today." Blackjack's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "You're the one who's wrong, my friend. My legacy isn't ending here. It's just beginning." The scarred man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "We'll see about that, won't we?" With that, the gunfire erupted. The world around Thomas spun into chaos once again, the deafening roar of guns filling the air, the sharp crack of bullets cutting through the canyon. Blackjack and Thomas both opened fire at the same time, their shots ringing out as the first rider fell from his horse, a plume of dust rising in his wake. Thomas's hands were steady now, no longer trembling with fear. The fight had already begun, and he was already deeper in it than he ever expected to be. The shots rang out like thunder, echoing off the canyon walls and reverberating through Thomas's chest. His body moved instinctively, each shot fired with the calculated precision he had learned in years of survival, years of knowing how to kill or be killed. But in the chaos of the canyon, there was no time for thinking. There was only the violence, the way it consumed everything in its path. Thomas ducked behind a boulder, narrowly avoiding a bullet that cracked against the stone above him. His heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled for cover, his mind racing, trying to make sense of the madness unfolding before him. The riders were coming from every angle, their guns blazing, their faces a blur of rage and bloodlust. Behind him, Blackjack's shots rang out, precise and deadly. The outlaw didn't seem to flinch, didn't seem to care about the carnage. He moved with an almost mechanical calmness, as if this was all part of some grand plan. But for Thomas, this was no longer about surviving. This was about something far worse, about betrayal, about facing the demons that had been chasing him his entire life. He peeked out from behind the boulder, his eyes scanning the battlefield. The riders were closing in, their horses kicking up clouds of dust, their guns aimed with deadly intent. And in the distance, the sheriff and his posse were regrouping, their weapons raised, ready to take the fight to Blackjack and anyone else standing in their way. "Move, McKenna!" Blackjack's voice cut through the chaos, his gunshots now rapid, furious. "Don't just stand there like a damn fool." Thomas's instincts kicked in. He didn't have to be told twice. He grabbed the fallen rifle from the dust, his hand steady, his grip tight on the weapon. The canyon was small, a killing ground carved into the earth, and every rider had a target on their back. But Thomas wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for answers, for the truth of everything that had been twisted and turned around him. The first rider to appear on his left was an older man, grizzled and rough, with a scar running across his cheek. He raised his rifle, aiming directly at Thomas's head. But before he could fire, Thomas squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, and the man's body jerked back, his rifle falling to the ground as he collapsed into the dust. Another rider appeared, this one younger, his face twisted with anger. He charged forward, but Blackjack's shot rang out first, sending the man's horse into a wild spin. The rider was thrown to the ground with a sickening thud, and Blackjack didn't hesitate. His next shot was already aimed at another rider approaching from the right. Thomas moved, his body low to the ground as he crept toward a new vantage point, the rifle feeling heavier in his hands with each passing moment. The canyon was filled with the sounds of gunfire and screams, but there was something else beneath it all, something darker, something that gnawed at the back of his mind. They weren't just here for the bounty. This wasn't just about money. This was personal. And Thomas knew, deep down, that he was a pawn in a game much larger than he had ever realized. The next shot rang out from above, and Thomas felt the air crack with the sharpness of it. He looked up in time to see a figure move along the canyon wall, their rifle aimed at Blackjack's exposed flank. He barely had time to react before another rider moved in, this one with a Bowie knife gleaming in the sun. The man lunged at Blackjack, aiming for his throat, but Blackjack's quick reflexes saved him. With a twist of his wrist, he drew his revolver and shot the man point blank, the body dropping without a sound. Thomas gritted his teeth. There was no end to this, no way out. Every shot they took, every rider they felled, seemed to be replaced by two more. The canyon was closing in around them, trapping them in a deadly game of survival. His breath came in sharp gasps, his heart pounding, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Then a voice rang out, harsh and commanding, slicing through the gunfire like a hot knife through butter. Enough! The words came from nowhere, cutting through the chaos like an iron bar, and for a split second, everything stopped. The riders hesitated, their guns still raised, but the noise of battle dulled for just a moment. Enough! The voice came again, stronger this time. Thomas's eyes shot to the edge of the canyon, where a new figure had appeared, stepping out from the shadows of the rocks. It was a woman, tall and graceful, her long black hair flowing behind her like the darkness itself. She stood there, unarmed, with the kind of quiet power that seemed to halt even the bloodlust of the riders. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as he recognized her. It was Elena. Mary. She stood tall and regal, her eyes cold as the stone walls around them, her voice a perfect harmony of authority and fury. The riders, including Blackjack, froze. Thomas's pulse quickened. What the hell is this? Blackjack muttered under his breath, lowering his rifle just slightly, though his eyes never left the woman who had appeared like an apparition in the heart of the chaos. Mary stepped forward, her gaze steady, unwavering. This isn't your war anymore, Blackjack. Her words were like a slap in the face to everyone present. Blackjack's eyes narrowed, his hand still hovering near his gun. What the hell are you doing here, Mary? This was supposed to be my fight. Mary's lips curled into a grim smile. Not anymore. She turned her gaze toward Thomas, her eyes flickering with something darker. You didn't know, did you? About your family. About the lies. It's time for the truth. The riders were still, all waiting, as if the answer to their struggle would come from this woman, this figure of mystery who had somehow manipulated the very game they were playing. Thomas stood frozen. His mind raced. The realization that Mary was behind all of this, pulling the strings, turned his stomach. Everything that happened in this canyon, every death, every betrayal, she had orchestrated it all. Mary, Thomas whispered, barely able to keep his voice steady. What have you done? Mary's smile faded as her gaze softened, but the hardness in her eyes remained. I've done what had to be done, Thomas. I gave you a choice. Now it's your turn to make it. The canyon was silent. The weight of her words hung in the air like smoke. And in that silence, Thomas knew the battle was just beginning. The wind picked up, whistling through the jagged rocks, carrying with it the scent of dried dust and blood. The tension in the canyon was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Thomas felt a chill crawl up his spine as he looked from Mary's cold, calculating eyes to Blackjack's hardened face. His mind was spinning, a blur of memories, betrayal, and pain. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something Thomas had never seen coming. "Why, Mary?" Thomas asked, his voice strained with disbelief. "Why would you do all this?" Because it's the only way to make it right," Mary interrupted, her voice steely, void of any remorse. She stood a little taller now, the power she wielded undeniable. "The Morrison family killed my husband. Killed Timothy's father. Do you really think I'd let them get away with it?" Thomas swallowed hard, the truth of her words hitting him like a rock to the chest. His sister, his flesh and blood, had become the very thing they had all feared, a monster. The woman who had taken care of him, who had raised him, was now orchestrating a deadly game of vengeance. All for her son, the child she had been trying to save, a child she had used as a pawn in a web of lies and violence. Blackjack, standing beside Thomas, shot a quick glance at Mary, his lips curled into a knowing, bitter smile. "You think you're the only one with a reason to hurt," he growled. "You think you're the only one who's lost." But Mary's eyes never wavered. She was unflinching, almost serene in her righteousness. "You've done enough damage, Morrison. You've killed enough. You may think you're the law of this land, but I'm here to correct the wrongs. This is where it ends." Thomas's chest tightened, and he glanced at the sheriff's men, now positioned across the canyon, rifles raised, eyes scanning for an opportunity. They were confused, unsure of who to shoot, unsure of who the real enemy was. There were too many sides in this game, too many players, and far too many lies buried beneath the surface. "Don't do this," Thomas pleaded, his voice cracking. "This isn't justice. It's just revenge, Mary. You're becoming everything we swore to fight against." Mary's lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't warm. "Revenge is all that's left, Thomas. We don't get to choose what we become. We only choose how far we're willing to go to see it through." Blackjack's gaze flicked to Thomas then, a sharp, knowing look. "She's right, McKenna," he said, his voice low, almost resigned. "We've all become something we didn't choose, but you've got to decide right now. Are you going to be part of the reckoning, or are you going to be its casualty?" Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he wiped the sweat from his brow. His heart raced, and his thoughts blurred. He was trapped between the past he couldn't outrun and the future he had no control over. The truth hit him like a wave crashing against a jagged rock. Mary was right. He was standing on the edge of something much bigger than just a fight between a few men and a few outlaws. This was the culmination of years of suffering and pain, and there was no escaping it. The silence stretched between them, and in that moment, Thomas realized there was no easy way out. There never had been. "We're here, Morrison!" came a shout from the canyon entrance. Thomas's heart jumped in his chest. The sheriff's posse had arrived, splitting the canyon in two, ready for blood. It was happening. The confrontation he had tried to avoid was finally here, and there was no running now. Blackjack moved first, his movements as swift as a striking serpent. "It's time," he muttered under his breath. "Time to finish this once and for all." He pulled out his revolver, his hand steady, his expression unreadable. He was ready to face the consequences of the lives he had taken, the blood he had spilled. But Thomas wasn't sure he was ready to face his own demons. The weight of what he had to do next, the weight of the choices before him, was almost unbearable. "You still think you can run, McKenna?" Blackjack's voice broke through Thomas's thoughts, pulling him back to the moment. "You can't outrun this." But as Thomas stood there, watching the standoff between the sheriff's men and Blackjack's gang, something shifted inside him. He didn't want to be a part of this war anymore. He didn't want to be a pawn in someone else's game of vengeance. The distant sounds of horses' hooves echoed louder now, and in the distance, Thomas could see the glint of rifle barrels gleaming in the harsh sunlight. He didn't have much time. "Blackjack," Thomas said, his voice firm, steady for the first time. "This ends today." The outlaw laughed, a cold, bitter laugh. "You're not in charge here, McKenna. You never were." But Thomas wasn't listening anymore. His mind was made up. He wasn't going to let this end in more bloodshed, not when he could still make things right. "Drop your guns," Thomas commanded, his voice loud and sharp, cutting through the tension in the air. "All of you." For a moment, everything froze. Blackjack paused, his hand hovering over his holstered revolver, his eyes locking with Thomas's. Mary, too, seemed to falter, her expression unreadable. Then, a single shot rang out from the edge of the canyon. The shot rang out, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. The sheriff's men froze, their hands twitching near their weapons. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke a man. Thomas didn't know who had fired, but the danger was real, and he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Blackjack didn't flinch. He kept his eyes locked on Thomas, his hands still hovering over his gun, his face a mask of unreadable intent. "You think you can end this with a speech, McKenna?" he growled, stepping closer, his boots crunching the dirt with each step. "It's too late for speeches. It's too late for talk." Mary's gaze, sharp as a knife, flicked between her brother and Blackjack, her lips curling into a twisted smile. "You really think they'll let you go free, Thomas?" she asked, her voice laced with venom. "You think they'll just forgive everything you've done?" For a moment, Thomas didn't answer. His thoughts were a whirlwind of chaos. He remembered his sister as she once was, kind and gentle, and how her heart had hardened over the years. The child she had claimed was her own, the way she had manipulated every piece of this twisted game. It was all for revenge. But what cost? The death of everyone around them? "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Mary," Thomas finally said, his voice low but resolute. "I'm asking for it to stop, for the killing to end, for everyone to go home." Mary's expression twisted in a way that made Thomas's blood run cold. "Home," she scoffed. "There is no home anymore, Thomas. There's only what's been stolen from me. What's been taken from us. What you've stolen from me." Blackjack's voice broke the silence like a whip crack. "You can't undo the past, McKenna," he said, stepping back, his hand moving slowly to the revolver at his side. "But you can decide how it ends. You choose." Now, Thomas took a step back, his boots scraping against the dry dirt beneath him. He could hear the distant thunder of hooves, the sound of the sheriff's men closing in, but his focus was razor-sharp on the men in front of him. His mind raced, piecing together every possible outcome. And then it hit him. There was no winning here, no side that could walk away clean. But that didn't mean he couldn't make the choice that felt right. "I'll stop it," Thomas said, his voice growing louder. "I'll stop it all, Blackjack, but not like you want. Not with more death." Mary's lips parted in disbelief. "You're a fool, Thomas. You think you can walk away from this? You're tied to it now, tied to what they did, to what you did." For a moment, Thomas looked over at the sheriff, whose deputies were still poised, rifles raised, unsure who to fire on. He could see the confusion in the lawmen's eyes. Some were still unsure if they should be aiming at him or Blackjack. They were all in the middle of this deadly standoff, each with their own scars, their own reasons. And then, just as quickly, he made his decision. "Drop the weapons," Thomas said, his voice ringing with authority. "All of you." Now, the sheriff, still clutching his bleeding shoulder, looked around in hesitation. He wasn't sure whether he should listen to the desperate man or continue the fight. But it was the silence between them that spoke the loudest. No one wanted to die today. Not here. Not like this. Blackjack hesitated, the faintest flicker of doubt crossing his eyes. The outlaw hadn't expected Thomas to take charge. He'd thought the man would be too frightened to defy him. "Are you really going to walk away from this, McKenna?" Blackjack asked, his voice now a cold growl. "After everything? After the blood we've spilled?" Thomas didn't flinch. "I'm walking away, Blackjack. I'm walking away from the past. From a bloodshed." He looked back at the lawmen, their rifles still raised, their hands shaking, unsure whether to believe him. But Thomas wasn't the man they thought he was. He wasn't their enemy anymore. He was the man who would end this. Mary's voice, sharp as a whip, cut through the air. "You won't survive, Thomas. You're nothing without the vengeance. You're a ghost of what you once were." Blackjack moved, faster than a rattlesnake striking. He pulled his gun, his hand steady, but Thomas was quicker. He ducked, grabbing the rifle left behind by the deputy, and raised it to Blackjack, his hands shaking from adrenaline. "Enough," Thomas said, the word hanging in the air like a final judgment. Blackjack paused. For a long moment, they stood there, two men caught in the web of violence, of family, of betrayal. But in that silence, something inside Thomas snapped. He couldn't keep running. He couldn't keep hiding from his past or from the mistakes he had made. "Let it go, Blackjack," Thomas whispered. "For both our sakes." The outlaw's gaze softened for just a moment, and for a fleeting instant, Thomas saw a man who was as broken as he was. But that moment passed in the blink of an eye, and Blackjack slowly lowered his gun, signaling for the others to do the same. Mary stepped forward, her eyes narrowing, but she didn't speak. "I've made my choice," Thomas said, looking over at the sheriff, his voice steady. "This ends now." And with that, the canyon fell silent, save for the distant sound of hoofbeats echoing over the rocks. The sun was setting over the canyon, casting long shadows across the rocky ground. The wind whispered through the dry sagebrush, carrying the scent of dust and gunpowder. Thomas stood among the scattered bodies, his rifle lowered, his heart still hammering in his chest. Blackjack stood beside him, his expression unreadable, but there was something different in his eyes now, a flicker of respect, or perhaps something closer to regret. The sheriff's men were slowly lowering their weapons, their eyes flicking between Thomas, Blackjack, and the scattered corpses of Mary's hired guns. The lawmen had been caught between two worlds today, the law they swore to uphold and the bitter reality of the outlaw world they had never fully understood. Now, the silence was a weight, thick and heavy, and Thomas knew there would be no going back. "You did it," Blackjack said, breaking the silence with a hoarse voice. "You stopped it." Thomas looked at him, the weight of the day finally settling on his shoulders. The fear, the anger, the confusion, it was all fading now, replaced by something far more dangerous, the realization that he had just made an irreversible choice. "I stopped it, but at what cost?" Thomas muttered, his gaze moving over the bodies of the dead men, his sister's face haunting him. The truth about her betrayal still twisted inside him, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. "What cost do we pay for revenge?" Blackjack's cold smile didn't waver. "Revenge is a beast that always leaves you hungry for more. Ain't nothing else to it." Thomas clenched his fists, his knuckles white with the tension that still gripped him. He wanted to scream at the world, to ask how it had come to this, but instead he forced himself to look away from the carnage. He needed to focus. There was still a town to save, people to protect. Sheriff Garrett, still bleeding from his shoulder wound, slowly limped toward them, his face hard as stone. His deputies followed, eyes wide with a mixture of relief and unease. The lawmen had seen enough bloodshed to know when the fight was over, but that didn't mean they knew what to do with the people who had caused it. "You've made your choice, McKenna," Garrett said, his voice gruff, but not unkind. "But don't think for a second that makes you a hero." "I don't need to be a hero," Thomas replied quietly, meeting the sheriff's eyes. "I just need to make sure this doesn't happen again." Garrett grunted, looking away for a moment as he glanced at the fallen men. "You're right about that, but don't think you can just waltz away from this. You'll answer for your part in all this." Thomas felt the heat of the sheriff's words, but he didn't flinch. He had known this moment would come. Knew that even if he stopped Mary, stopped Blackjack, it wouldn't absolve him of the choices he had made. "I'll answer," Thomas said, his voice steady. "But not today. Today, I'm just trying to survive." Behind him, Blackjack had already mounted his horse, his dark eyes scanning the horizon as if he were preparing to leave at any moment. Thomas couldn't tell if the outlaw was planning to ride off into the sunset or wait for the lawmen to catch him. But either way, Thomas knew the bond between them was more than just a temporary alliance. It was a deal forged in blood, one that could never be undone. "You've got a long road ahead, McKenna," Blackjack called over his shoulder as he spurred his horse. "This ain't over. Not by a long shot." "I know," Thomas replied, his voice a whisper lost in the wind. as Blackjack disappeared into the shadows of the canyon. The remaining lawmen started rounding up the survivors and tending to the wounded. Thomas didn't need to look back to know that the sheriff would be keeping a close eye on him. He was a man marked by the past, bound by choices made long ago, and now he would have to live with the consequences. "Let's get this town patched up," Sheriff Garrett said, his voice rough as he walked toward Thomas, his injured arm hanging limp at his side. "You're not the only one who's going to have to live with what happened here today." Thomas nodded, but as they made their way toward the town square, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a deal with the devil himself. The road ahead was uncertain, the weight of his decisions heavy on his shoulders, but for the first time in years, he felt the faintest flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the end of the madness. Maybe the town of Dead Rock would live to see another sunrise. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the town of Dead Rock. The streets, once filled with tension and bloodshed, had begun to settle into an uneasy calm. The wind, now cooler than before, swept through the empty alleys, picking up the dust of a day that had changed everything. Thomas McKenna walked slowly toward the town's center, his boots heavy with the weight of his decisions. Behind him, the sheriff's men moved about, their faces a mixture of relief and uncertainty. They were still figuring out what to do with him, but he didn't care anymore. The battle was over. For now, at least. He paused at the edge of the saloon, staring at the dusty wooden steps where he had once hoped to find redemption. But redemption had slipped through his fingers long ago. He had learned that no one escaped their past. Not him, not Blackjack, not even Mary. Thomas had done what he thought was right. He had saved the town, even if that meant choosing sides that had once seemed unimaginable. The lawmen were still there, watching him, but they no longer saw him as just a fugitive. He had been the one to stop the madness, but he had also been the one to start it. Looking out toward the horizon, Thomas saw the faint figure of Blackjack, Morrison, disappearing into the distance. The outlaw was a part of this world, a part of the chaos that would always exist just beyond the law's reach. Thomas knew their paths would cross again, as they always did in the Wild West. But for now, he was free. "You've made your choice," Garrett's words echoed in his mind. "But don't think for a second that makes you a hero." Thomas wasn't a hero. He wasn't even sure what he was anymore. But as he stood there, watching the shadows stretch across the land, he realized that sometimes survival was the only thing that mattered. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The sun would rise again over Dead Rock, and the town would begin to rebuild. Some wounds might heal, but others would remain. The past had carved its mark into everyone who had lived through it. And for Thomas McKenna, there was no turning back. As he walked toward the sheriff's office, his steps heavy but determined, he could feel the weight of the future pressing down on him. He had survived the storm, but what came next was anyone's guess. In the desert, mercy rode slower than the wind.